just to
This
let everybody
conference will
know.
now be recorded.
And over to you, April.
Oh, thank you. I forgot I was doing this. I was all caught up in our conversation. Good morning, everyone. My name's April. I'm the programming chair at the Family Business Association. Thanks for joining us for our Staying Connected webinar series. Our association really exists to connect and support families and business to drive the economic prosperity of Atlantic Canada, something I think all of us on the call are pretty passionate about. And since we've been living in what I've been calling the upside down, the Family Business Association has really just shifted everything online. So we're still here. Our website has like a very comprehensive list of all the resources and support available to you during this time. Our events are online. So like this event today gives you access to our trusted advisors and other family business members. And next week we're launching our Staying Connected Coffee Talk, which is really just like, let's get together, find out how everybody's doing, what sort of issues are you facing, and see how we can help each other. So I'm really looking forward to that and to this discussion today, which has been, like, I'm in my role at Simplicity, I talk to businesses all the time, and this issue of getting back to work is of course the thing that everybody's talking about. So oh, I forgot to say, Family Business Association, we have waived our fee until August. So if you're a business owner and you want some guidance through this, like contact us. We'd love to hear from you. We'd love to have you join us. So now I'm going to introduce very quickly our speakers because I know everybody really wants to get to this topic. You can, I'm not going to read their whole bio. It's posted on the Family Business Atlantic website. So Christine Eisner. I met Christine, I think, through this association, right? What's this one? So great place to network. Christine's been providing HR guidance to emerging small and medium-sized organizations in Atlantic Canada for more than 20 years. Her passion is really working with your people to make your business successful. So thank you for being here, Christine. And then Ian Brown, who I just met this morning. So again, someone else I met through this association. He's a partner at Boyne Clark on the business law team. Focused on labor and employment law, and he regularly advises clients on all matters related to the workplace, hiring, termination, absenteeism, which is also a very hot topic right now, how to get people back to work and feeling safe. So I'm going to just throw it over to the two of you to take it away. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, April. Yes, for anyone that is joining the Family Business Association, it is a fantastic and very positive place to do networking. It's very real, very authentic and genuine. So if you're on the fence right now, I would highly recommend it. And the 1 degree of separation in Nova Scotia, particularly HRM, can be felt because I sort of knew everyone that I spoke to in my first round almost immediately from another facet of life. So it was quite interesting to bring us all together. So welcome everybody. This conversation I hope is very relevant. I hope it's something that's top of mind, and I hope it's coming from a positive and anticipatory place for you and your business. The tide is feeling like it's starting to change, although we may feel like we're still right in the middle of the throes of this pandemic. I believe we're now at the place where our heads and our minds and our bodies should be starting to focus on what does re-emerging look like. And today, not to reinvent the wheel to many other conversations that have happened, we wanted to focus on some of the HR and employee relations relevance to some of the challenges or some of the thoughts that you may have about how to plan and effectively hit the ground running to be able to bring your workforce back and bring them back in a way that's safe, that will lead to a high level of productivity and hopefully a little bit more peace of mind so that you can focus and concentrate on the business of business rather than spending tremendous amount of time and energy and effort in the first couple of weeks on how to manage safety and transition from the pandemic. So we've provided just a quick little infographic below just to keep us kind of on track. If you joined Ian and I the last time and we're part of the conversation. We're very talented at going down rabbit holes, and we're really, really excited if it comes to a really great discussion that we can have. So please throw us off our game because we're very welcome to it. So the infographic is to keep us a little bit on base or on point. But in the same respect, if you're like, yeah, I know all that, I'd really like to get to the meat of a particular question, just throw it up into the chat room, and we're happy to join you and walk down that path instead. The last meeting that we had, we talked a lot about what to do with your employees as you kind of navigated more inward. And this time we're going to talk about what happens when you kind of look outward, and really in this pre-opening bubble that we're in, where a lot of people are looking at other provinces and other countries and really anticipating what it's going to look like from us. The conversation is about how can you take the time right now, and what are the things you can focus on in order to prepare yourself and your employees to reemerge. So when it comes to reopening, one of the primary pieces that you'll hear me say throughout this whole thing, and it may sound incredibly obvious, and apologize if it is, and you're thinking, yeah, I already know that, Christine, but communication is absolutely 100% fundamental, particularly at this point in time. One of the other pieces that I'll talk about, because I think there's a lot of great resources out there when it comes to operational planning and safety assessment, is the emotional element to this, and how do you navigate that with your employees? We have to recognize and appreciate that everybody is feeling this a little bit differently, and when you start bringing folks back into your workforce, although everybody may theoretically have the same goal in mind, I think how we enter into that emotionally is going to bring people in probably at various stages, and how to identify where to have a start point with that. And really what it comes down to is communication. So with all that in mind, if I'm a broken record, Ian, please feel free to jump in and say you've said that, Christine, or anybody can for that matter. But let's just start with the pre-opening. And what exactly is pre-opening? Well, as much as we try to put like phases and stages into what this pandemic is, because I think structure makes us all very comfortable, I'm going to call this the pre-opening. And it's not that I have any magic formula to that, is that it's just, it feels to me right now where we are both in the world and with the numbers and the flattening of the curve and the numbers coming down, I feel like we're anticipating, we're almost like taking that deep breath before we jump back in. So that's why I would suggest that this is probably our pre-opening phase. And, if you haven't already, from an HR or an employee perspective, right now should be the time where you're thinking about what your organizational structure will look like when you open. For many of you, that is really sitting down and having a very detailed either list or discussion about who will be returning and who will not be returning to your workplace. Depending on your industry, you may find that you are in need of a workforce reduction that's perhaps more permanent than you anticipated. For others, that may be that you need to be ramping up because your offering is different, or you have found that you unexpectedly have a growth mode where a lot of businesses have put themselves online. You may find that you now have parallel offerings both live in a bricks and mortar location as well as something online, and you may need to be ramping up. And if that's the case, that's a fantastic problem to have. But that also means a new organizational structure as well. So taking the time right now to literally go through and say, okay, what was previously the way that we operated and organized ourselves and our business? What may have changed, and how does that influence or impact the way that we organize our staff when we return? Who will be returning and who will not? And Ian and I had a conversation with respect to this in our previous conversation, and it warrants certainly having that discussion as we move into this conversation. A lot of people, when they sit down and do that organizational structure, may find themselves in a place where you go, okay, so there's going to be some permanent layoffs, or I really need this person back, but now that they've been on the CERB for the last X number of weeks, am I going to get them back? So I'm gonna defer to my colleague here and again ask you the $1 million question, Ian. What happens if you have somebody who you would like to return and does not want to return? Or what happens if you have a permanent layoff and you now need to communicate that permanency to your former employee? Take us through a little bit of what that looks like.
Well, there's a whole lot in there, so thanks for that. I guess we want to look at it in two parts to kind of expand on what you've been saying. So I think first, before you're making that decision, you would have to have gone through all your plans, and part of that, and we'll come to that, I think, in this conversation, is all the steps for occupational health and safety and making sure everything's ready to go from a safety standpoint from your workplace. Not to mention, of course, your operational needs and seeing who you need and all that sort of stuff. And so then if you're at the stage where you're ready to bring them back, there's the one question of, ready to start working again. There's the one question of the person that doesn't want to come back, maybe because they're getting the CERB. And then a separate question of the person that you just simply don't have a need for anymore because their position has been essentially eliminated through either the restructuring, but really through as a result of COVID. So for the elimination of the position, if you're in a non-union environment and you've laid somebody off, there's kind of two parts to it. For one, maybe you laid them off at the start of this and you didn't give them any notice because there's an exception in labor standards code, or maybe you paid them some notice. So it kind of depends on that process you had of when you laid them off. And if you had paid them and gotten a release and everything, well, you probably don't have to do anything. But if you're like a lot of folks and just said, because of COVID-19, we've got to shut down, you can't come to work, and we'll keep you apprised of the situation. Under the labor standards code, there's a distinction between a layoff and a discharge. And if you've laid someone off and you bring them back within a year, then their continuity of employment isn't impacted, their tenure. So they were a 6-year employee and you laid them off for 6 months and bring them back, they're still a 6-year employee when they come back. So with that in mind, if you have employees that have employment tenure, they have a right to be reinstated, unless, of course, you have a situation where their job has been bona fide eliminated. So you're going to have to take a look at your length of service for some of your employees and assess whether or not there's an obligation for you to bring them back, and whether or not their position has properly been eliminated, and whether or not you can support that elimination with evidence to show that you're being truthful. It's just simply not there anymore. And in which case you wouldn't have to bring them back. But I think there's an obligation to tell the employee that they have been discharged and the circumstances why. And there may be, depending on your employment agreements and depending or whether or not you have an employment agreement, a notice obligation. You may have to give common law severance to get a release. So there are some risks in there. And I think, of course, this is the lawyer answer, but I think that when you're making your analysis of who you need back, you should be considering too what your severance risks are, because you may have a junior employee that's great, but is 30 years old and has been with you 2 years, versus someone who's been with you 25 years and is 57, who is she's probably not at 100%, but just as good as the junior almost. Then even though you might want to keep the junior, it would be extremely expensive and possibly a reinstatement claim for that senior one. So I think that analysis has to be, these questions have to be part of your analysis. So there's that. And then the whole other can of worms is the people getting a CERB benefit or some other benefit that don't want to come back. And that's where we get into, well, is it safe for them to come back? Do they have any bona fide concerns? Because if you're recalling somebody to work who's been laid off and hasn't been discharged, they have to come back to work unless it's unsafe. And that's why you should have all your ducks in a row to make sure that you have proper safety equipment and you've got proper social distancing guidelines and you've really figured out a battle plan for returning to work, and you have appropriate documentation to communicate to these employees, because you need to be able to respond to those concerns. And I think that's a dialogue. I don't think it's come back now or you're fired. It's, you indicate to the employee they're supposed to come back. If they refuse, you ask why. If they express concerns, you answer those questions to make sure that, sometimes it's going to be conversationally, of course, but it should be backed up in writing, because when push comes to shove, it's an objective test about whether or not it's safe for them to come back to work. And it can't be just they're afraid. Now, another point, to not go on for too long, in Nova Scotia, there is an obligation under human rights for an irrational fear of contracting a disease. I said this probably in our last webinar, but I hadn't in my practice ever come across this in practice. But this is where it could, in theory, be happening. And there might be an obligation to accommodate. So this is a very case-by-case sort of scenario. But from an occupational health and safety analysis, if it's safe to come back and they just don't want to, and they don't have a good reason, then you can basically tell them in writing they've abandoned their employment, issue a new ROE that says that they've quit, and they'll lose the CERB benefit. But part of that dialogue has to make it clear to them that that's what you're going to do if they don't come back. So there's some risks in there.
So it's a great segue, Ian, because when we talk about the organizational structure and really determining who will be returning or not, and we get to the safety assessment, and it's a valid point. So the pre-opening is you want to be able to have these active and open conversations with your staff prior to. If there's any golfers on the line, I will say this: when they finally opened the courses, there was a collective cheer that went up in my neighborhood, both from the golfers and also for the non-golfers that have been putting up with the golfers in the house complaining. But there was this disparity, because there were some courses that were ready and ready to go and ready to open the very next day, and there were others that needed the time to get their plans together and move forward. So, this pre-opening period is perhaps, yes, to operationalize a lot of what we need to do, but it's also to start those regular conversations with your staff, so that the day that you are ready to open, many of these conversations, much of your workforce is already prepared. And as we move into this point, safety assessment is going to be absolutely critical. Right now, under the Occupational Health and Safety Act, we don't have anything that addresses COVID per se, to say what these absolute specific requirements are. But assessing what your workplace is and ensuring that you have the right parameters in order to be safe for both your employees and your clients, and just in general, is critical and paramount at this point. So what does that
for just 1 second?
For sure.
To throw in there. Under occupational health and safety, you have a due diligence defense available. So to Christine's point, that's why the plan is so critical. And despite maybe a lack of information that's perfectly clear, say from occupational health and safety, you have to make the best decisions based on the evidence that you have, and that's following social distancing, that's having hand sanitizer, personal protective equipment where necessary, those sorts of things, and clear documentation to show that you've communicated to the employees and you've taken these steps, because that will help you if you end up in that sort of situation. Sorry, go ahead, Christina.
That's fantastic, and it's so doing nothing is no longer, it's not going to be acceptable. So if your own personal opinion is, well, I don't feel like there's risks, you need to be able to identify at least what common practices have been mandated at this point, which is social distancing, hand washing, etc. The safety assessment and the planning phase of this it's of tremendous value, obviously, for your business. It's of tremendous value for your clients. But from an HR perspective, pre-planning and being able to anticipate concerns or fears and having a plan ahead of time is just going to save you so much time, energy, and effort with having these conversations to validate it after the fact. So getting out ahead of it and being really proactive is going to be key. With respect to the safety assessment piece, and April can probably speak to this if there are specific questions, but Simplicity launched another branch of their business called MarkSafe, And their primary focus is to be able to conduct very comprehensive and very customized safety assessments for each of your business and ensure that you have an appropriate plan. So if it's something that you feel that you're not equipped at this point to be able to completely understand all the nuances of what would be in a proper safety assessment or a safety plan, reach out to April and she'll be able to give you the details, or you can go to marksafe.ca in order to, they have some free downloads right now, and there are some behind the paywall. But it's a tremendous effort that they have put forward, and it's incredibly relevant right now. But essentially at this point, taking the time to be able to really understand some of the things that need to be in place is going to reduce, as I said at the very beginning, that whole emotional piece and that fear. So as you're speaking to your employees that perhaps are coming back off of a CERB or off of a work share, or they are returning to your workplace ahead of time, having those necessary pieces in place is absolutely critical. The other piece
and
is,
if I want to just jump in for
yeah.
1 second too, just to kind of expand on that point. I mean, if you put yourself in the other person's shoes and they're afraid to come back and they're worried, you're more likely to put their mind at ease if you're able to communicate to them a clear plan of approach and to show them that if they do have questions, what safety precautions are in place, what steps you've taken to show that you've thought about it, you've addressed it, and you're ready to go. And I think that will help significantly. Certainly, there's going to be a certain component that might just be obstinate no matter what, either because they would rather stay home or because they have a genuine fear. But I think having all that in place is going to be, to your point, I mean, it's critical, and it will also help to try and convince the other side and mitigate some of those immediate risks.
Yeah. And we'll talk about some of the details from an HR perspective of pieces that will probably, as far as documentation and changes, as we roll through towards the other phases within the visual graph that's available, we'll talk to some of the specifics of that as well. When do you contact your team? Well, I think that's like a thumbprint. That is going to be a little bit unique and different for everyone, depending on what kind of situation you currently find yourself in. I mean, if you were in a layoff situation with your employees at the very beginning of March, if you haven't had regular and consistent conversations or touch points at this point, I would say, again, going back to the mantra, communication is key. Reaching out at this point and just trying to have those conversations prior to an opening, or being able to allow people to mentally and physically prepare, because in some cases people may have childcare needs that they may need to fulfill. They may need to adjust or modify in order to return to the workplace. Some of the things that they've now had to adjust and modify to for the downturn. So having that conversation with them and being consistent in those conversations is really critical. So if you have yourself organized and planned, where you can talk about, anticipating an opening date, anticipating the new normal, being able to talk to the safety requirements and potentially any other questions that they may have, and to be able to do that, preference depending on the size of your team, whether it's one-on-one, whether it's a group setting, that really does become very personalized depending on the size and the scope of your business. But I would say, and I've had a few questions that have come up too, is, am I allowed to talk to an employee who's on the CERB or who I've laid off? You're perfectly able to reach out to them, particularly if you're trying to give them anticipation of a return date. Ian, do you want to speak a little bit to how we would communicate with folks that perhaps are not returning, that we're aware of at this point, and what your thoughts are on when you would reach out to them?
You mean the folks that you've decided you're not going to bring back?
Yes.
That one's less of a legal question, I think, and more of just sort of a general kind of risk approach question, I would say. So what I would think is that, when it kind of be twofold, because I think that the initial conversation you just talked about reaching out to the staff to say, okay, for example, we're anticipating that we're going to open in mid-June. We don't have a date yet, but we just want to let you know these are all the plans we have in place, and we want you to let us know if you have any questions. So that's the first step, to communicate that, so that there can be a dialogue before people come back to try and mitigate people digging their heels in at the last minute. And I think as those conversations are happening, that's probably the time to reach out to certain employees, if you know for sure they're not coming back, to let them know and negotiate any kind of exit at that point, because they're going to find out that these conversations are happening. They're going to be worried about their position, and you've got a duty to deal with them in good faith. So in my view is, if you know that this is the case, then you should deal with it. You really shouldn't put it off. But I like to have kind of both at the same time, because if you go just telling people they've been permanently laid off and don't have any talk about coming back, everyone else is going to think they're on the chopping block.
Yep.
And vice versa, if you're bringing everyone back and then if you leave somebody out, well, that's a problem. So it's kind of around the same time, I think you should be ready to have both discussions.
Yeah, it's a great point. And quite frankly, I mean, there's an amplification effect right now that, folks are going to be hypersensitive to any conversations when they, and they are talking. I assume most employees are still connecting with one another, whether they're in the workplace or not. So, be very, very mindful that there probably is conversations. And if you get that, did you get a call? Did you get a call? Try to get ahead of your own communication strategy so that it's effective, and you're not either unduly stressing someone out, or you're not.
I think the isolation will amplify those concerns. Sorry to interrupt, but I think just to feed on your point, I think like you said, the amplification, it's just being isolated is just, with all the other stresses at the moment, is really going to increase those concerns. And it's a time to be more sensitive, I think, than one normally would.
For sure. Sarah, could you just scroll our visual up there? Perfect. Thank you. So then we talk about the next normal, and I think this is a great place for us to kind of springboard off. I'm tired of hearing the word pivot. It makes perfect sense, and we're all doing it. But I also said, like, swivel seems to be the new pivot at this point, because we start here and then we move over here and then we jump over here, etc. So, it's all about adaptation. And the one thing that we need to give ourselves and our employees permission with is, this is all net new to us. It is absolutely net new. So, cut yourself a break. And I would highly emphasize that having really authentic and genuine conversations with your staff is really, really critical at this point. But if you don't have all the answers, it's okay that you don't have all the answers, but it's important that you have those active conversations, and you are doing your very best. When we look at reopening, it says you do this stuff with your employees, not to your employees, and that is incredibly, incredibly critical. As I mentioned, we don't know where people are emotionally or mentally with what's happened with COVID. Everybody is kind of internalized, and they've had their own journey with this in a lot of ways. And while you're not responsible to be a psychologist and understand all that, you are a business owner. You do need to appreciate that many of the conversations that you may find to be difficult are probably necessary to have as early as possible, just to get a really good sense and foothold of where your staff are. If you have someone who, and keep in mind, for the last few months, we've been appropriately worried and concerned about what the impact of COVID is, and we've been in isolation as a result of listening to Premier McNeil and Dr. Strang, et cetera. So our mindset is the world's out to get us. Our mindset is the grocery store needs to be handled. We need to travel within our communities incredibly cautiously. So just saying, we're back open for business, here we go, folks, and not recognizing that there's going to be an integration period. We need to adapt to that. And having those conversations ahead of time and planning and communicating ahead of time is critical, but also recognizing that there is a tremendous amount of behavioral changes that are going to impact our workforce. And how we interact and how we engage both with our staff, and how we interact and engage with our our clients and our customers, we're trying to meet people in the middle of where they may have experienced this. So having a level of grace and being prepared to adjust and adapt as you go in order to make people comfortable and in order to address some of the concerns that they have are going to be critical. Like Ian and I have talked about this offline about, there's much of this that may become litigious because people are going to dig in, but really we don't need to start from that place. This all needs to happen from a conversational environment. And if you can address folks' concerns ahead of time and have plans in place ahead of time, you're actually going to get probably a very relieved, comfortable, and productive workforce coming back, as opposed to having these conversations and navigating through weeks and weeks after you've opened. In there, what were we talking about? We were talking about not having a playbook, and we were talking about not diminishing the emotional experience for everyone. Is there anything else that you wanted to add when we're talking about the workplace compassion planning? The duty to accommodate would be one that would first come to mind with me. Can't hear you, Ian.
I had it on mute. Sorry. To your point, I mean, all communication is key to all of this, and it really is important because, in my view, sometimes you'll end up where you need the lawyer and you need the letters back and forth. But if it ends up that it is being litigated, then a lot of the times I think that could have been avoided with some proper steps being taken at the start. So that's why, to our point earlier about communicating your plan of action and all the steps you're taking to put people's minds at ease. But absolutely, you don't have to be a psychologist, but you do have a duty to accommodate, and that involves illnesses, disabilities, mental illness. And I can just make an educated guess that it's more likely that we're going to have people in this circumstance suffering from those issues, or people who do suffer for those issues, having those issues exacerbated by the extra stresses that we've all been under. And so to that point, you have to be cognizant of that, and you should be sensitive to your employees, and work with them where you can. And that's it. I'm being vague, but it's a very case by case analysis, and it may be that you have to accommodate with a personal day or something, but you have to recognize that there are these concerns, and how you handle it is really important, not just between you and that employee, but between you and the group as a whole, as for morale in general, and perhaps even as a reputational concern. So just to be aware of those issues. You don't have a duty to know what's going on with the employee specifically. You're not entitled to know their personal diagnosis or something like that. But if you see that an employee is not acting the way they used to, or if there's proper concerns there, you do have a duty to inquire to see, are they okay? Is there anything you can do? Is there anything that they need? And that's the first step.
Perfect. Awesome. Sarah, I'm going to get you to scroll right to the bottom of the graphic there, because I think now is a good time to have a bit of discussion about kind of the technical elements. So I think we've effectively flogged communication, and active and due diligence with respect to communications, meeting employees where they are, recognizing the change into that last point that you just made is being really dialed in. I think there is, in some cases, and we've talked about this, in some cases we have business owners that may say, oh, thank God we're done with that whole pandemic thing, back to normal. And diminishing the impact of COVID, I think, is going to be the wrong approach to take, simply because the resonant effect of this and, the long-term effects and impacts or relevance of this is going to be tremendous. So, we keep hearing about the next wave,
I
and
was going to
it's
say, I was going to
imminent.
jump in and say it's very likely it's going to be back. So
That's right. That's right. So when we talked earlier about the planning, some of the pieces that you have to recognize, and it was a bit of an aha that when I was on Simplicity's call, that the light bulb kind of went on for me, because people are saying, okay, you're back to work, your operations running effectively. You have somebody who tests positive for COVID, and now they have to quarantine, and your team, you're contacted by the Department of Health, and you have to quarantine for 2 weeks. What's the contingency planning for your workforce when it comes to circumstances like that? And that could happen at a second wave, that could happen at a third wave, that could happen as an isolated incident to your business. So having a plan, not just on how to reopen, but having a long-term plan is not only, absolutely critical for the functionality of your business and the continued operations of your business. Your team's going to need to know that, because that's going to be a question that is 100% going to come up. Okay, we're back to work now. And as I said about this emotional journey and that psychological piece of it, is people are going to want to know, okay, well, how are you going to ensure that if this happens again, now what happens? Now what do I do? Like, the structure and the framework that we're also used to working within, with the security of employment, has now been diminished. We know nothing is permanent. We know nothing is guaranteed. And right now, without a vaccine in place, we know that this is now a significant part of our lives. So having that plan and recognizing that this is going to be part of the narrative and part of the dialogue is going to be critical in order to give that level of safety and assurance to your staff. Ian, did you have a comment that you wanted to kind of touch on there as well?
no, there's just so much that comes out of this, and it's really going to depend on your business. And if I just think of the business that I'm in, we've been able to adapt by moving online for the most part and working from home, working remotely. And I think we've learned a lot by having done this. And I think it's important to take notes of what you've learned in this, because you may have to reapply them. And so that can go into whatever your next plan of attack is in case it resurfaces. And there's so many layers that are coming out of this too. So I don't want to go too down the tangent, but there was the prime minister was talking yesterday about talking with the province to make mandatory 10 days sick leave. Now, I don't know that's a big bureaucratic process in itself, but that's the federal government trying to find a way to make employers, I guess, kind of bear the cost of having employees off work for 2 weeks. But in a flip side, Christine and I were talking yesterday, another way to look at this is if you have the right amount of leave in place, that can be seen as an investment, because if your employees go off and are afraid they're not going to get paid because they have to take sick time, well, if they have some paid sick time in place, they're going to use it. If they don't have it, they might come to work when they're sick because they've got bills to pay. So just to kind of throw that in there, when you're thinking of your approach here and how you're going to handle things and how you might handle that second wave, you've got to be ready for the bridge to the second wave, which is if people start to get sick, how are you going to address it? And maybe you don't have any paid sick time, but maybe you want to consider it. So there's that.
Yeah. And Ian, that's a really good place, because we had talked yesterday. We had this very long list, and I'll say it really quickly, and maybe we can kind of work through it. We were talking about policies.
Yeah.
So exciting. People just, I don't know how many people wake up in the morning and get super stoked about the idea about talking about policies. So we're going to go there right now.
It might just be us.
Yeah, it might just be us, sadly. Sadly, the geeks on the call are definitely the ones who are like, yay, policy. So, but we talk about like that impact, that perhaps your mind is starting to turn to it, perhaps your mind isn't, but vacation usage, time and attendance policy, your health and safety policy, your joint occupational health and safety committee. For many businesses that are super, super small, a JOSH committee isn't even on your radar. You may have a health and safety representative solely, and what is their obligation and what's the responsibility they may have. Sick days and what happens with all of this. We're talking about COVID pre-testing, and what does that look like? Remote and flex work arrangements, performance management, bonus and commission structures. Like, a lot of this has had either an effect on 2020. When I think about the bottom ones, when I think about performance management, when I think about bonuses and commissions and ability to be able to earn that variable pay. But then when we talk about the higher level of the house there, and we talk about vacation and time and attendance and health and safety, these are all elements of what your current function as a business. They need to be at least reviewed to see if they still make sense. And those are the ones that we're just thinking about right now. So, Ian, you and I were talking about vacation usage, and okay, so you have somebody who has been working remotely who really doesn't, having a vacation in your kitchen doesn't feel quite the same as being able to go down south. So they've been holding on to their vacation. We get back to the work environment, and do we have this tsunami of vacation requests where people are like, okay, now I want to spend 2 weeks at the cottage, or now I want to travel wherever they can. So, again, all conversational, but this element where it's going to be these challenging conversations ahead of time. Some of the things that we had talked about with
Can I
time and
just jump in for a
attendance.
second there?
For sure.
On the vacation point, I think it's important if you are in an environment where you have folks working remotely, or you have a combination of a few in the office, a few working remotely, and everyone is kind of holding on their vacation. Now's the time to talk to employees and encourage them to use some of that time, because also, I was even walking with my wife talking this morning, saying like, I feel like I need a vacation, which and it's kind of the mental health component, because even though I'm not working the same way I was before, the change itself is tiring, and the uncertainty is tiring, and the constantly, at least in my line of work, the constantly checking the updates and seeing if the government changed anything and all that sort of stuff.
Yep.
So there's value, I think, in unplugging, even if it is, I envy the folks that have a cottage and go there for a week, but if you have, even if it's just being at your home and staying on your deck, it's different than having to check into work every day and do that work. So there is value in taking that time now. And there has to be an understanding amongst the employees that for the operational needs of the business, you can't have everyone, if the office or the store or whatever it is going to open on July 15th, you can't have everyone taking vacation a week later, because you need people there to make the machine move. So I think it's wise to talk about that one sooner rather than later. If you are in a kind of operating environment now, if you have people that have been laid off, then that's different, because hopefully you would have paid their vacation pay when you laid them off. But if you're working remotely mixture, you should start encouraging that now, and look hard at what your policies say for carryover. Is a use it or lose it policy? That's technically that's a legal problem there, but a lot of people have them. But you should look at that approach, and you may even want to consider putting in a temporary policy for vacation due to COVID-19 for this just the year. And employees may not like that, but if they know it's just for now and will be reviewed later, that might help it. It might be absorbed better if that was the case.
Yeah, and Ian, what are your thoughts on even a blackout period? I know there's some organizations that already have specific periods of time that they've written into their policies where they've had either, it's high volume, or it's a specific season that they don't allow vacation requests. And the same as you're saying with a temporary vacation policy, would it be possible with enough bandwidth, like enough lead time, to be able to put in a blackout period to which you say, okay, you know what, we're back to work on July 15th. From July 15th until the end of August, we can't handle any vacation requests. So take it now or plan for it later, but that period of time, that's still something that businesses can look at as well?
Yeah, the answer is yes. More notice is better. Any big change to an employment agreement, written or otherwise, is always a small risk of an employee complaining and claiming constructive dismissal. Constructive dismissal essentially is if the employer changed the job fundamentally, then the employee can say, well, you violated the employment agreement and I'm entitled to notice. I don't see that as a practical risk for a vacation policy in the middle of a pandemic, but it is there, especially if you had a grumpy employee that's been there a long time and is waiting for their out. So the way to mitigate that is by giving it as much advance notice as you can. So if you're thinking about the fall now, then why don't you get on your policy right now? introduce it as soon as you can. And if you give 8 weeks notice or 2 months notice that this is going to be the case in the fall for vacations, then that's really going to mitigate a lot of those risks.
Yeah, thank you. The other one that was, well, again, we're geeks. The other one that was fun to talk about yesterday with respect to policy is we were talking about like contact tracing and pre-testing as far as health testing prior to people returning to work. We're hearing a lot of that in the media, and we're hearing a lot of that with some of our neighbors to the south with respect to, some of the pre-planning that they're doing in order to allow or enable employees to return to work. You and I were talking a little bit about that. So give me your thoughts on what COVID-19 testing looks like in the new world.
Yeah, that's a couple good points there. And when looking to our neighbors to the south, I think you can get a good idea of where the wind might be blowing. But they work in a very different environment when it comes to employment, labor, and privacy law, in that it's very, I would say, for the most part, employer favorable and not very favorable to privacy. So in Canada, we have a lot more protections to try to balance that uneven power between an employee and an employer. And you have to be very careful about those. So in terms of deciding that, for example, if you want to decide that your employees need to be tested before they come back, well, you really have to ask yourself the question, why? If you are in a safety sensitive environment, or such an environment that the testing is, I imagine, a care facility where you've never stopped. It doesn't make sense for me to say this because you'd be in the care facility anyway. You wouldn't have stopped, but just for the hypothetical argument, if you're in a situation where those employees are going to be exposed to people that are vulnerable, then that might be a bona fide requirement, and that would make sense. If I imagine an office environment where I work, I can't see that really being justified unless you have some probable grounds for testing, like the person got sick and didn't want to come into work. You say, well, okay, we should be tested, because then you have, I think, a duty, because you've got some reasonable grounds to think that that person might be at risk. That might put your employees at risk. So you could then, I think, ask them to be tested. So it's sort of a probable cause kind of analysis, but I'm encouraging against a knee-jerk reaction and a reasoned approach to that. And we're going to see some developments with that. And I think I just heard on the radio this morning on CBC, they were talking about vaccination and concerns about people who have concerns about vaccination. And for example, in Nova Scotia, although the vaccination rates are pretty good for measles, mumps, things like that, for the flu, they're quite a lot less. So it was more of a pondering kind of news story, but it will be interested to see about that and where that goes. And it may be that you can require as a bona fide requirement that the employee get vaccinated before they return to work. But there's that one will be a legal minefield, and it'll certainly raise a lot of interesting questions. But these are things to think about. And I think it always comes back to look at the practical needs for your business. What do you need to do to keep those people safe? And is what you're asking the employee to do relevant to that threshold? And being mindful of the employee's privacy in that process.
Right. So to go back to, I mean, you and I, from the nature of the businesses that we work in, we mesh on a lot of things, and we always talk about the common sense element to it. So at the very beginning of the conversation, we talked about not diminishing COVID. There's always the pendulum that swings in a variety of different directions. Either there's some organizations that want to just, put this behind us and go back to an old normal, which will not exist. And then there will be others who potentially want to try to mitigate any possible potential exposure, which again, we're going to have to kind of come to the middle ground on what's reasonable. But the one thing that I've been hearing from every answer that you've been giving is bona fide occupational requirement. And a lot of it is common sense. Like if it's relative to your business, that's fine. And that's something that perhaps you need to look at, but it needs to be, and again, going back to safety assessments, et cetera, you have to see what is critical, what's appropriate, and what's sustainable. That's the other piece to this as well is,
and I just want to throw one more point in there, not to confuse it too much, but I was mostly talking from a non-union employment law perspective. I should raise that if anyone here is operating in a unionized environment, then there's an obligation here there may be an obligation for a dialogue with the union. I still think it comes down to that common sense bona fide occupational requirement, but the scrutiny level is going to be much higher in that environment, and it also has to be implementing a policy is much more complex in such an environment. It has to be consistent with the collective agreement, and there will be a dialogue. So I just want to flag that as well.
No, appreciate that, and you're right. And I mean, communication.
Yep.
A lot of discussion will be happening, obviously, with business owners and their employees, their union reps, if that is the case, for sure. But hopefully, what we're doing is we're kind of opening the discussion and opening the opportunities for questions at this point. But those are the primary ones that if you can get out ahead of it, and even if you're starting to turn your thoughts to pieces and elements that perhaps you need to either adjust, modify, as Ian said, even for the first season of work, as we'll call it. The long-term pieces of changes that will need to happen is whether or not, an individual's job may change as requirement of increased hygiene practices. Does it mean that, the signage, et cetera, like who is going to be responsible for some of those elements to maintain kind of that new normal in your office? So I'm seeing a question. Can employers enforce vaccinations for their employees?
That's a great question. And I'm not going to say that I know the answer 100% on this one, because I don't. But I started thinking about this one just recently. And Christine and I talked about this just yesterday. And really, I still think it comes down to that sort of occupational health and safety obligation with employee privacy concerns. And I think that if we get to the point where the vaccine comes out, it's recommended for everybody, and you're in a situation where you think that the workplace could be jeopardized by an employee refusing to vaccinate, you may be able to tell that employee that until they get the vaccination done, they can't come to work. There's some extra layers in this one, because I have my opinions about this, but they might try and make their arguments about why they shouldn't get it. There could be some quasi-scientific argument. I'm going to table that one. You might get into the irrational fear of contracting a disease argument. And to be charitable too, there could be a religious argument that for certain religions, and I don't know off the top of my head, but I could see or imagine where there could be a religious argument where they don't do that. Then it turns to an accommodation question, i.e., note that I didn't say you fire them because they didn't get the vaccination. I said you tell them they can't come to work until they get the vaccination. And it might be accommodating those concerns that if you have ability to work remotely, that you have that unvaccinated employee work remotely. There could be a middle ground, so I want to flag that. But I think it's possible that we get to an environment where certain companies, say in certain lines of businesses, I could imagine airlines, I could imagine healthcare workers, all those sorts of things. And I think probably for healthcare workers, it's mandatory anyway, that you have to do this if you're going to do this job. More challenging in an office environment where I am, but I can see that sort of situation saying that if you want to work here, you're going to have to do this.
It's a good question, Ian. I'll just add one other point to this, and then perhaps we can open it to any questions. But a lot of this will be we're working with existing employees. A lot of what may change is as we start to onboard and requirements of the job as we hire new employees. So very similar to some of the very standardized questions that we ask candidates. We may start to ask whether or not they have been recently tested positive for COVID-19. Have they been recently? It will depend. This is definitely a new normal, and a lot of folks that I have chatted with as well, that we compare this, and I think we even compared this, and we talked about travel and travel security protocols prior to 9/11 versus what happened after 9/11. And, you know, we've normalized a lot of, like, we don't think twice now when we take our boots and our shoes and go through, you know, go through security and our small little liquid bottles, etc. That's just become part of the norm. And this is going to be very similar, I believe. And I think, you know, in years to come, you know, it'll just be a regular thing to be asked whether or not you've had your recent COVID vaccine or what have you.
Well, it's funny. It's funny too because we don't in most jobs you don't ask if someone had a measles vaccination or a mumps vaccination or the other vaccinations too, right? So it'll be an interesting dialogue should it arise.
Yeah, very true.
We got another question here. Is there an obligation to consult with the province on back to work plans? I think this applies to restaurants and personal care businesses. So I'll jump out and say that if you've been shut down by the government, I think you should have a dialogue with the government of what they are requiring of you to reopen. Some businesses, again, using the law firm office environment example, our firm is, and many of the firms have stopped operating in the office for safety concerns and all those sorts of things, but we've not been mandated to shut down. What's different in Nova Scotia than a lot of provinces is the Nova Scotia's just said businesses A, B, C, D, and E can't operate, as opposed to other provinces that said no one can operate except for the ones we allow. So we have a different kind of approach in Nova Scotia, and I think it would be wise to make sure that if you're opening a restaurant, for example, and the government is saying you can open on these conditions, that you meet all of those and make sure that they're happy before you open up.
Okay, so here's a question. How do you deal with social distancing when you work on the 13th floor? It's a great question. I was talking to a client yesterday that in their office, they have 5-foot hallways. So to pass in the hallways, it's to maintain social distancing at +5, there's certain requirements, etc. Many of the conversations that I'm hearing in Toronto is, how is it that you manage and navigate people even getting on elevators so that they can get up to their office building? And I think this is a similar question. It's strategy, and there's some. And Ian, please, if I'm speaking out of tune here, a lot of this is incumbent on even the employee themselves. Like, there are certain things that we can manage as employers that we have an obligation and a due diligence to do so. We talked about the signage. We talk about, you know, having these open communications, looking at your policies, and ensuring that you have every opportunity for people to practice appropriate protocols such as social distancing, your 2 meters, you know, proper personal hygiene, etc. There's going to be a normalizing at this point where we can offer those structures, but employees themselves also have an obligation to practice some common sense with putting them in place. So if it's a matter of how do you get the person to the 13th floor, I'm sure that there's going to be protocols about and common sense saying, okay, you know what, we can't socially distance on the elevator. You're going to have to just and the employer has to give a little bit more time, perhaps, for the employee to come to work. The employee also has to accommodate themselves and adjust their own schedule to make sure that they keep themselves safe and that they do all the necessary procedures and necessary steps in order to get to work safely as well. So, you know, we're going to get into this. Whose responsibility is it? It's always has been our own personal responsibility to practice common sense and appropriate hygiene, hand washing, etc. Like, as we transition back into the workplace, our employers need to facilitate our ability to keep ourselves safe. But I strongly believe that still falls within the practice of the individual to keep themselves safe and appropriately sanitized as they would.
So
yeah, and I'll jump in there too. Sorry, just to say, you don't only just want to look at the 13th floor per se. It's getting there. Maybe it's just one person on the elevator, and it's within the floor. You know, how many are you going to allow in the bathroom? How many are you going to allow in the kitchen? Those kinds of things. And maybe you want to stagger your scheduling so you limit the number of people that come in at one time. So that's just what I want to throw out.
Excuse me. Great discussion. Thank you so much. I know we're past time here, but I did take some notes. The importance of communication, of course, and planning. Figuring out who's coming back. The human rights component, that's so interesting. Like, I don't feel safe, and what's that all going to look like? And the complexities around, not knowing when we're going to open back up. So the uncertainty can be quite unnerving. I really did appreciate your thoughtfulness on each of these topics. I know one of the things that happened at Simplicity immediately was that every day we met. So when you were talking about communication, that really hit home with me. Like, every morning at 8 a.m., the entire team is on. Every Monday, we get a COVID update and an update on the impact to the economy and what it looks like across the country and in other countries as well as getting everybody focused on what's happening. So everything you said is just great advice for businesses and how to navigate this with the least amount of risk. And it's just going to be interesting to see what happens. I am really, when you were saying about policies, yeah, those were very exciting. Like, what's going to happen? What's going to happen? Like, this whole idea of people coming to work sick is over. And one of the things we've been talking about at our office is, like, prior to COVID, the flu caused $2 billion in lost productivity without including healthcare costs. So we probably should have been doing a lot of these things before now. But anyway, it's just, it's interesting time. So thank you so much for that discussion. We'll probably want to do this again, because as we get more information on when we're opening up, like, all of this stuff will just become much more relevant as each day passes. So thank you so much. I really loved being here with you today. And thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much. Thanks for joining, guys.
It was fun.
Oh, and Christine, thanks for the shout out on Mark Safe.
Hey, listen.